July 17th, 1943, 0412 hours. Tank depot perimeter, 8 kilometers southeast of Prokhorovka, the Kursk salient. The ground shuddered beneath the depot's concrete slab like a heart in cardiac arrest. Each tremor came from the Panzer front, 1,200 meters away. Shockwaves rippled through frozen mud that sucked at boots and locked diesel solid inside fuel lines. Shells from 47 advancing Tigers arced overhead at 850 meters per second. They detonated in cascading fireballs 150 meters wide, painting the night horizon orange. The air filled with the metallic tang of cordite mixed with spilled 76-octane fuel and burning rubber. Amid this inferno, 38-year-old factory janitor Ivan Dmitrievich Kovalenko crouched beside T-34 number 217. Its V2 diesel engine had been dead for 14 hours. The fuel cutoff valve was frozen shut, just like every one of the 31 tanks lined up behind barbed wire that sagged under 22 kilograms of shrapnel per square meter. Kovalenko's hands were black with oil, scarred by 12 years mopping factory floors in the Urals, hands that had scrubbed conveyor belts and drains, that had lifted 180-liter oil drums day after day, year after year. Those hands now held a 12-cent spool of scrap copper wire, scavenged from a bombed-out radio mast. A bent nail worth 7 cents. And a pair of pliers he had forged himself from tractor linkage 2 winters back when tools were scarce and improvisation was routine. Boom! A 75-millimeter round vaporized the guard tower 47 meters away. Concrete fragments and gravel rained down across the yard, biting into exposed skin like hornets. Kovalenko did not flinch. He did not look up. He did not curse. He did not run. He leaned closer to the engine housing, shielding the valve with his body, as if the machine beneath his hands were something alive. By that point, death had already been busy that night, and Kovalenko understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by the shells overhead, but by what he did with his hands in the next few minutes. And by that point, the real problem was no longer the shelling. It was the silence coming from the engines. Kovalenko slid his fingers beneath the open access panel and felt the metal of the fuel cutoff valve. Cold. Unnaturally cold. The fitting was standard, 2.3 centimeters of brass installed on thousands of T-34s, designed to regulate fuel flow from twin 120-liter tanks into the V2 diesel engine. On paper, it was simple. Fuel in, pressure builds, engine turns. On paper. In reality, the valve was dead. Inside its 4-liter chamber, diesel fuel had thickened until it clung to the walls like axle grease in winter sheds. The spring-loaded poppet sat immobile, locked in place by ice and by rubber seals that had shrunk just enough to strangle movement without breaking it. The seals were nitrile rubber, cheap, wartime rubber, produced quickly, stored poorly, never tested for repeated freeze and thaw cycles. When daytime temperatures had risen to plus 12 degrees, the rubber expanded. When the night dropped below zero, it contracted. 18%. That contraction pinched the valve stem 2 to 3 millimeters off center. Not enough to snap it, not enough to crack the housing, just enough to stop fuel flow completely. The mechanics had already tried heat. Oxyacetylene torches burning at 1200 degrees Celsius had been applied directly to the brass housings. The rubber seals softened, collapsed inward, and melted into sticky plugs that blocked the bore entirely. They tried force next. Hammers bent valve stems 4 millimeters off axis, ruining alignment and rendering the entire assembly useless. Replacement valves were requested, then requested again. None arrived. Supply lines were cut. Chelyabinsk lay 1,900 kilometers away. Rail yards burned. Convoys vanished. By 0400 hours, 31 tanks sat immobilized across 2.1 hectares of depot yard, their 76.2 millimeter guns silent and useless. Beyond the depot, German Tigers gathered 4.7 kilometers to the west, supported by 88 millimeter flak positioned on elevated ground. Casualties mounted while engines did not start. 312 men were already dead along the depot's outer ring. Among them was loader Yuri Petrov, killed at his post 19 meters from tank 217. Kovalenko closed the access panel slowly, because by then he understood something the engineers did not yet see. This was not a mechanical failure. It was a pattern. And while the engines remained silent, the man crouched beside them was anything but remarkable. Ivan Dmitrievich Kovalenko was not trained for this. He was not educated for this. He had never been expected to make decisions that mattered beyond a factory floor. He was born far from the front in a Volga tractor collective, 1,470 kilometers east of Prokhorovka. From childhood, his life followed a narrow path: work, routine, endurance. From 1923 until 1940, he worked as a stable hand, cleaning stalls, hauling feed, keeping machinery moving without understanding how it truly worked, only that it had to. In 1938, he was reassigned to Ural Vagonzavod, not as a mechanic, not as an engineer, but as a factory janitor. The year Stalin's production quotas tripled, forcing the plant to push out 2,100 T-34s per month. Assembly lines never stopped. Mistakes were buried. Shortcuts became policy. Kovalenko cleaned what others abandoned. He swept beneath stamping presses that punched 47,000 hull plates each year. He drained 180-liter oil drums until his hands cracked and bled. He unclogged conveyors that jammed under impossible schedules. No officer stripes marked his chest. No technical diploma hung on his wall. What he carried instead were calloused palms and a memory for patterns. War found him at 37, not with a rifle but with a broom. After the German advance of 1941 pushed to within 19 kilometers of Nizhny Tagil, Kovalenko swept shrapnel from assembly lines while tanks rolled out unfinished. "Sweep faster, Ivan," the foreman shouted. He did, but he also fixed what he cleaned. On chassis number 4671, a hydraulic line jammed and threatened to halt production for 3 days. Kovalenko rerouted it with baling twine, saving 72 hours no engineer had time to spare. He was noticed, but not promoted. Men like him were useful, not important. Drafted as essential labor, he arrived at the Prokhorovka tank depot on June 28th. His assignment was simple: mop 3,200 square meters of concrete every day. Around him, 181 mechanics argued over manuals and diagrams. They debated tolerances and clearances. They waited for orders and replacement parts. Kovalenko listened. He watched. He noticed which arguments repeated and which failures did not change. By the night of July 16th, as 31 tanks sat dead behind sagging wire and the sound of artillery drew closer, Kovalenko understood something quietly, without announcing it. The problem killing these engines was not something that could be ordered away. And if no one else was going to touch it, he would. And it was during that night, while the depot waited and the engine stayed silent, that Kovalenko stopped thinking like a janitor and started thinking like a man who had nothing left to lose. July 16th slipped into darkness without ceremony. The temperature fell steadily, dropping below zero as wind crept across the open concrete yard and settled into every seam of metal. The 31 dead T-34s sat in a loose line behind sagging wire, their silhouettes barely visible in the intermittent glow of distant fires. Somewhere to the west, artillery continued its slow, methodical work, each distant impact reminding the depot that time was already running out. Kovalenko finished his assigned work early. The concrete was clean, the oil stains were gone. No one noticed when he slipped away toward the tool shed, carrying nothing more than a grease bucket and the same wire he had been turning over in his pocket all evening. The shed was cold and dim, lit only by a carbide lamp that hissed softly as it burned. Shelves sagged under mismatched parts, bent tools, cracked housings, and components salvaged from machines that no longer existed. This was not a place where solutions were expected to be found. It was a place for leftovers. Kovalenko sat on an overturned crate and dismantled a discarded fuel valve, placing each piece carefully on his knee. He worked slowly, not because he lacked confidence, but because haste had taught him nothing in 12 years of cleaning other men's mistakes. He studied the valve stem, the poppet, the seals. He pressed the rubber between his fingers and watched it resist, then give. He remembered a winter from years earlier, back on the collective, when a water pump froze solid during flooding. The mechanics had cursed and waited for parts. Kovalenko had wrapped binder twine around the flapper, added tension where none was meant to exist, and pulled the blockage free by force instead of heat. The pump had worked long enough to save the harvest. No one wrote it down. He looked back at the valve in his hands. Rubber pinched upstream. Ice held downstream. Heat made it worse. Force broke alignment. Replacement did not exist. The manuals were silent because the manuals assumed supply lines and time. Kovalenko threaded the scrap copper wire through the bleed opening, testing angles, feeling resistance, learning the shape of the obstruction without seeing it. He bent the nail against the crate edge, flattening the head until it would catch and hold. He did not rush. He tested tension. He tested leverage. He snapped the wire once, then twice, and adjusted his grip without frustration. When the wire finally pulled free a frozen plug from the mock valve, it did so quietly, without drama. The movement was small. The result was not. Kovalenko exhaled slowly, as if afraid the idea itself might disappear if disturbed. Outside, the guns did not stop. The depot did not sleep, and no one knew what he was doing. By the time the carbide lamp burned low, Kovalenko was no longer asking whether it could work. He was asking how fast he could do it under fire. And when the night finally began to thin into morning, Kovalenko carried his idea out of the tool shed and back into the open yard, where the war no longer waited politely at a distance. At 04:12 hours, the shelling intensified. The rhythm changed. Impacts walked closer to the depot, not randomly now, but with intent, as if someone beyond the horizon had begun to measure the space. Concrete trembled beneath each detonation, and fragments rattled against steel hulls like thrown gravel. Kovalenko crouched beside T-34 number 217, the same tank he had knelt next to hours earlier. Its engine had been silent for 14 hours, its crew nowhere in sight. He opened the access panel again, the metal shrieking softly as it moved, and reached inside with hands already numb from cold. He threaded the copper wire through the bleed opening exactly as he had practiced, feeling for resistance rather than forcing it. The space was tighter here than in the shed. Ice had crept deeper. Diesel gel clung stubbornly to the inner walls. He adjusted the angle by instinct, not calculation, guided by the memory of how the wire had bent in his hands the night before. A shell detonated close enough to throw dust across his shoulders. The blast wave flattened him momentarily against the hull. He waited, counted his breath, then continued without looking up. He bent the nail into position, its flattened head catching against the valve housing. The wire flexed. Tension built. This was the point where force usually destroyed alignment, where mechanics reached for hammers or torches. Kovalenko did neither. He pulled once. The wire slipped. He pulled again, slower, letting the nail absorb the strain. The wire creaked, but held. On the third pull, using the nail as a fulcrum, the wire slid deeper and caught. Kovalenko felt the resistance change, not disappear, but shift, like ice breaking free from a boot heel. He pulled hard. Something gave way inside the valve. Not a snap, not a crack, a soft release, almost imperceptible beneath the noise of artillery. Fuel pressure surged through the line. 4.2 atmospheres, unseen but unmistakable. The starter motor whined, protesting at first, then turning faster. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the V2 diesel engine bellowed to life, coughing black smoke into the cold air and filling the yard with the smell of burnt rubber and hot fuel. The sound cut through the shelling like a shout. Kovalenko leaned back against the hull, breathing hard. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sudden release of tension he had been holding since nightfall. He wiped diesel from his beard and looked at the running engine as if expecting it to fail again. It did not. A nearby mechanic stared at him in disbelief. Someone shouted. Another shell exploded farther down the yard. The engine continued to run. One tank was alive. 30 more remained dead. And with daylight approaching and the distance to the panzers shrinking, Kovalenko understood that this first success was not a solution yet. It was a test he would now have to repeat, again and again, faster each time, while the war closed in around him. And once the first engine continued to run, the silence around Kovalenko changed its meaning. The sound of the V2 diesel did not announce victory. It announced time. A narrow window measured in minutes, not hours, before the yard would be under direct fire. Kovalenko pushed himself upright and moved immediately toward the next tank because hesitation now would erase what he had just proven. Tank number 218 sat only a few meters away, its hull scarred by fragments and its tracks half buried in frozen mud. The valve failure was identical. The access panel opened the same way. The cold bit deeper this time, the metal stealing sensation faster than before. Kovalenko worked by memory rather than feel, threading the wire through the opening while artillery continued to range closer. A shell detonated 8 meters from the tank, showering the yard with debris. 2 guards went down screaming. Kovalenko flattened himself beneath the hull, waited for the shock wave to pass, then crawled back into position without looking at the bodies. He had learned long ago that stopping to look did nothing but slow the hands. The first pull failed. The wire slipped free and snapped back, striking the housing hard enough to sting his fingers. He adjusted the bend of the nail, increasing leverage slightly, careful not to over-torque and crack the brass. The second pull went deeper but stalled against thicker ice. He pulled a third time, harder now, committing to the motion. The resistance gave way abruptly, and fuel surged through the line. The starter motor protested, then caught. The engine roared to life with a violent cough, belching smoke that drifted across the yard and drew shouts from nearby crews. 2 tanks. The realization hit him immediately. This was not a one-time fix. The failures were identical. The solution was repeatable. Speed, not invention, would now decide how much it mattered. Tank number 219 was already waiting. Kovalenko moved faster, ignoring the stiffness in his hands and the dull ache in his lower back. He threaded the wire almost without looking, muscle memory replacing thought. The pull was clean. The engine fired in under 10 minutes. 3 tanks. By the time the 4th attempt failed, when the wire kinked under stress and the nail slipped from its seat, the shelling had closed to within 12 meters of the yard. Shrapnel cut across the ground in hissing arcs. Someone shouted for him to stop. Someone else shouted for him to keep going. He bent a second strand of wire, doubling tensile strength, and fed both through the opening together. The leverage increased. The risk increased. So did the result. The valve freed itself with a jolt that nearly tore the wire from his hands. The engine caught immediately. 4 tanks now idled where none had moved an hour earlier. Depot Commander Major Volkov arrived just long enough to see the smoke rising from the exhausts. He stared at Kovalenko in disbelief, then at the running machines, then back at the approaching barrage. "Do 5 more," he said finally. "Then we abandon." Kovalenko did not answer. He was already moving toward the next hull because the distance to the panzers was shrinking, and the math in his head had begun to change. This was no longer about fixing tanks. It was about how many minutes he could steal before the enemy reached the wire. And then the tanks did something no one in the depot had expected them to do that morning. They began to move. Tank number 217 rolled first, its tracks biting into the frozen mud as the driver eased the clutch forward. The sound was unmistakable. Steel on earth. Power under control. Men who had been crouching behind crates and walls lifted their heads in disbelief as the machine crept past them, alive again after hours of silence. Its turret traversed slowly, methodically, as if waking from sleep. The gunner tested elevation. The breech slammed shut. The first 76mm round fired at 0547 hours, cracking the air and echoing across the yard. A panzer silhouette vanished in flames 600 meters out. Cheers broke out and died just as quickly. There was no time for celebration. The second tank was already moving. Tank 218 lurched forward, followed by 219 and 220, their engines roaring in uneven harmony as crews scrambled aboard, shouting coordinates and commands over the noise. Each vehicle formed up instinctively, spreading into a loose firing line that cut across the depot's open ground. German infantry advancing through the wire gap hesitated. The rhythm of the attack faltered. Machine gun fire shifted as targets reappeared where none had existed minutes earlier. Tracers stitched across the yard, but now they were answered by cannon fire. Kovalenko did not watch any of it. He was already beneath the hull of Tank 221, threading wire through another frozen valve while the ground shook around him. Shrapnel clanged against armor overhead. Dirt fell into his collar. He worked blind, counting movements by habit, knowing that if he stopped now, the window would close. The 5th engine came alive in under 8 minutes. The 6th took longer, its valve housing warped by a near miss. Kovalenko shaved the opening crudely with the edge of his pliers, widened the angle just enough, and forced the wire through. The engine fired on the second pull. 6 tanks. By 0630 hours, 7 T-34s were operational. Their combined fire cut into the advancing infantry, tearing gaps in formations that had expected only wrecks and silence. 2 Panzer IIIs burned at the edge of the steppe. A half-track exploded near the wire, its crew scattering under machine gun fire. The effect rippled outward faster than orders could travel. German units slowed, then halted, uncertain whether they had misjudged the depot's strength. Soviet infantry, moments from collapse, rallied behind moving steel. Men who had been retreating turned and fired again. Kovalenko heard none of it clearly. The noise had blended into a constant roar, a pressure that flattened thought into action. His hands moved automatically now, wire and nail and pliers working together as if they had always belonged in this place. At tank 223, the wire snapped twice before holding. At 224, the seal split during extraction, spraying diesel across his face and eyes. He wiped it away with a sleeve and continued. Time mattered more than comfort. By the time the 8th engine fired, the depot yard had changed shape. What had been a collection of dead machines was becoming a line of resistance. Smoke hung low. Spent casings littered the ground. Men shouted orders instead of prayers. Major Volkov returned, shouting above the din. "How many?" he demanded. "8," someone answered. Volkov stared at the advancing tanks, then back at Kovalenko. "Keep going," he said, "as long as you can." Kovalenko nodded once and crawled toward the next hull, because by now the meaning of his work was unmistakable. Each engine he restarted did not just add a tank. It rewrote the enemy's expectations, minute by minute, while the distance between the depot and the panzers continued to shrink. And as the tanks pushed outward from the depot, the enemy adjusted, because nothing on that front stayed misunderstood for long. German fire intensified within minutes. Artillery shifted from ranging shots to concentrated barrages, walking inward across the yard with deliberate spacing. Impacts fell closer now, 8 meters, then 6, then 4. Each blast lifting sheets of frozen earth and tearing fragments from exposed metal. The air thickened with dust and smoke until visibility dropped to a few dozen meters. Kovalenko felt the change immediately. The ground shook continuously, not in isolated shocks, but in a rolling vibration that rattled teeth and blurred vision. He flattened himself beneath tank 225 as shrapnel screamed overhead, waiting for the rhythm to break before crawling back to the valve housing. The failure this time was different. The valve stem was not just frozen, it had been twisted slightly off alignment by a near miss, the brass housing distorted enough to resist the wire. Kovalenko tested the opening, withdrew the wire, and made a decision without looking up. He doubled the strand again, twisting 2 lengths together to increase tensile strength. The copper stiffened, harder to guide, but stronger. He widened the bend of the nail, increasing leverage at the cost of precision, then fed the wire into the opening by feel alone. The first pull failed. The second slipped. The third held long enough for the ice plug to crack free, but not cleanly. Diesel surged unevenly, sputtering the starter motor. Kovalenko waited, cleared the line manually, and pulled again. The engine caught. 9 tanks now idled where hours earlier there had been none. German infantry attempted to close the distance under covering fire. Machine guns opened at point-blank range, stitching the ground around the hulls. One round struck the side of tank 226, spalling metal inward and killing a crewman instantly. The tank continued forward regardless, its gun firing until the breach fell silent. Kovalenko did not look up. He had learned that survival depended on ignoring what could not be changed. He moved to tank 227, slid beneath the hull, and worked through pain as shrapnel tore into his thigh. Blood soaked his trousers. He tightened the wire anyway. The engine fired. By 0730 hours, 10 tanks were operational. Their fire cut a shallow arc across the steppe, forcing German units to ground and buying the depot a narrow pocket of time. Soviet infantry regrouped behind the moving steel, reforming a line that had nearly collapsed an hour earlier. Major Volkov shouted into a field phone, relaying numbers he barely believed himself. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered. There were none. Everything now depended on how long the depot could hold with what it had. Kovalenko adapted as the failures evolved. When wire snapped, he braided it. When housings warped, he filed them crudely. When seals tore free and fuel sprayed across his hands, he looped the wire tighter and forced it to hold under pressure. Each fix grew faster, rougher, more desperate. The 11th tank came alive after 6 minutes, the 12th after 5. The 13th took longer, nearly costing him his life when a shell detonated close enough to collapse part of the hull shielding him. He crawled free, coughing, ears ringing, and finished the pull anyway. Smoke hung low across the yard now, blurring friend from enemy. The noise was constant. Orders were shouted and misunderstood, but the tanks continued to move, and that movement alone was enough to hold the line. By then, Kovalenko understood that this was no longer a repair effort. It was a race between his hands and the enemy's guns, and neither side could afford to slow down. And by mid-morning, the depot reached the point where every mistake became irreversible. At 09:12 hours, German artillery shifted again. The pattern tightened. 88mm shells began falling in controlled brackets, cutting the yard into shrinking sections of usable ground. Each impact arrived with surgical precision, lifting slabs of concrete and shredding anything caught between detonations. The margin for movement collapsed to seconds. Kovalenko felt the pressure change in his chest before he understood it in his head. The ground no longer trembled in waves, it convulsed. Sound flattened into a constant roar that erased distance and direction. Men shouted without knowing who could hear them. Orders dissolved into instinct. Tank 228 died before it could fire a single round. A direct hit tore through the turret ring, killing the crew instantly and scattering fragments across the yard. Kovalenko crawled past the burning wreckage without stopping because the next tank was already waiting. The valve on Tank 229 resisted harder than any before it. Ice had reformed after repeated heating and cooling, creating a thicker, denser plug. Kovalenko tested the opening, withdrew the wire, and doubled it again, twisting 3 strands together until his fingers ached and the copper cut into his skin. He fed the braided wire into the housing slowly, millimeter by millimeter, listening for changes in resistance. Shrapnel struck the hull above him, ringing like bells. A second explosion collapsed part of the adjacent tank, showering him with dirt and fragments. He waited only long enough to breathe, then pulled. The wire held. The ice plug broke free unevenly, tearing part of the rubber seal with it. Diesel surged violently, spraying across Kovalenko's hands and face. The starter motor flooded and stalled. For a moment, the engine did nothing. Kovalenko cleared the line manually, ignoring the burning in his eyes, and pulled again. The engine caught. 14 tanks were now operational. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. German infantry faltered under renewed fire. A panzer advanced too far and was hit from the flank, erupting in flame at 600 meters. Another reversed hastily, throwing up plumes of dirt as it withdrew. But the enemy did not stop. Nebelwerfer rockets screamed overhead, saturating the perimeter with phosphorus. Fire spread across the yard, burning hot enough to blister paint and scorch exposed skin. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Kovalenko worked through the smoke, coughing, his hands shaking from blood loss and cold. At Tank 230, the housing cracked under strain. Fuel poured out. He looped the wire around the damaged section, cinched it tight, and forced the valve open anyway. The engine ran rough, but it ran. At 231, a shell detonated close enough to knock him unconscious for several seconds. When he came to, his ears rang and his vision narrowed. But the tank was still there. He dragged himself back under the hull and finished the pull. 15 tanks. Major Volkov appeared briefly, his uniform torn and blackened. He grabbed Kovalenko by the shoulder and shouted something that did not register. Kovalenko nodded automatically and kept moving. Words no longer mattered. By 10:30 hours, 16 tanks formed a ragged line of steel and smoke, their combined fire holding back forces that had expected nothing but wreckage. Casualties mounted on both sides. The depot burned. The wire perimeter sagged under debris. Kovalenko crawled toward Tank 232, knowing without calculation that this was the limit of what a single man could endure. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his vision blurred. The copper wire felt heavier than before. And yet, as the next shell fell closer than any before it, Kovalenko understood that the outcome of the day would be decided in the next few minutes, and that stopping now would erase everything he had already done. And in those final minutes, the depot did not collapse. It held. The next shell fell short, then another long, then none at all. The German barrage loosened, its rhythm breaking as targets moved where fixed points had been expected. Smoke thinned just enough to reveal steel still rolling, guns still traversing, crews still alive behind armor that had been written off hours earlier. Tank 232 fired twice in quick succession, its recoil shaking the ground as a panzer withdrew behind a fold in the steppe. 233 followed, then 234, their combined fire carving a ragged arc that forced the enemy to ground. Infantry who had reached the wire fell back, dragging wounded and leaving equipment behind. Kovalenko lay beneath the hull of Tank 235, his hands numb, his breath shallow. He threaded the wire by touch alone, vision narrowing to a tunnel of motion and sound. The pull was weak. He reset, braced his feet against the concrete, and pulled again with everything that remained. The engine caught. 17 tanks now moved where silence had stood at dawn. By 11:30 hours, the German advance stalled completely. Orders shifted from attack to consolidation. Panzers repositioned farther west, using distance rather than momentum. The depot, reduced to smoke and broken concrete, remained in Soviet hands. Medics finally reached Kovalenko as he crawled away from the last hull. The jagged fragment had torn through his thigh. Frostbite had claimed sensation in 2 fingers. Diesel and blood soaked his clothes. He resisted being carried at first, pointing back toward the yard, until someone shouted that there were no more valves to pull. In the hours that followed, the numbers emerged slowly, as numbers always do. 31 tanks had been dead at dawn. By midday, 17 were operational. Those 17 mounted more than 50 crewmen who would otherwise have fought on foot or not at all. Enemy losses were counted cautiously. Multiple armored vehicles disabled, dozens of infantry casualties, a stalled advance that had been expected to break through before noon. Soviet losses were heavier but not catastrophic. Time had been bought. Major Volkov filed his report that evening with hands still shaking. He wrote of improvised repairs, of unauthorized methods, of a janitor who ignored manuals and orders because neither applied to the conditions of the day. Higher command questioned the account, then confirmed it. Kovalenko was promoted in the field. A rank meant little to him. He asked only for water and for the pain in his leg to stop. When asked how he had known what to do, he answered simply that machines failed the same way people did, quietly, for reasons no one wanted to see. The wire trick spread. Mechanics wrote it down. Others copied it. What began as scrap copper and a bent nail became standard practice across depots facing winter conditions. Production lines adjusted, Downtime dropped. Small changes multiplied into larger effects. Ivan Dmitrievich Kovalenko did not become famous. After the battle, he returned to work where he was needed. His hands slower, his body marked, his role unchanged. He swept floors again. He fixed what others overlooked. He never spoke of that morning unless asked. Years later, the depot would be dismantled, the concrete broken up, the wire rusted away. The tanks replaced by newer machines with different failures and different solutions. But the lesson remained, written nowhere official, passed quietly between those who worked close to steel and cold. Wars are not only decided by generals or weapons, but by ordinary hands solving ordinary problems under extraordinary pressure, one small pull at a time.